Welcome to Daily Post India. This is Jasmine Chabra. In the modern era of science technology, now science has made nothing seems impossible. In Italy, where a 101-year-old woman surprised everyone by giving birth to a baby. This Italian woman has become a mother of a 9-pound baby after her cervix transplant. The reason for this was despite the age of the woman, the cervix was transplanted. The transplant operation was done by a private clinic doctor Alexandru Poplecki in Turkey, but it is considered illegal under the European law. The name of this old woman is Anatolio Vertadella, who gave birth to her 17th child. The name of the newborn baby is Francisco. She considered this as a God's blessing. After giving birth to 16 children, she was feeling downright worthless at the age of 48 due to her cervix cancer, but she is still proud after becoming a mother again. Dr. Alexandru, who was leading a team of doctors and did the operation, said, "No one can decide whether it is right or wrong. They say that Anatolio has given birth to a beautiful baby. It is not less than a gift from God. She is very happy to give birth to her baby." Thank you for watching, and for more updates you can follow our Facebook page Daily Post India and our website www.dailypost.in, and don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel also.
Bear with me for the first 5 to 10 minutes on today's message. But with modern technology advancing as much as it has with technology, science, medicine, things that actually seemed impossible just 100 years ago, a century ago, now seem to be possible as our understanding has advanced into things that at one point were unknown. From the way that we communicate with people around the world, to our understanding of the cosmos, all the way to defying possibilities in biology like that one that is described in the opening clip. This story that you just watched went viral a few years back. It circulated as memes. People were sharing the article of this. And it detailed this incredible story that seems to defy the biological clock. It actually flirts some of the lines of ethics. As stated in the opening clip, no one can decide whether it's right or wrong. And the reason why is not because of the science, more as it has to do with the fact that you have an older woman who might not be able to care for her child very long. What do you do with that child? Regardless of it, you have these news reports, these articles like that of the website newsviewstrends.com that outlines the miracle where they write about this grandma who gave birth at the age of 101. And as the website states, it's impossibly surprising, but it's true. Here's a screenshot of that article on that website. Once again, News, Views, and Trends. And it states, as stated in the opening clip, that 101-year-old Anatolia Vertadella from Italy became pregnant after a transplant operation. Further down the article, it goes on to say that after this successful delivery, she stated, "I could not procreate since I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. For a long time, I believed God was punishing me, but now I understand that God is real and He is listening to our prayers. He has granted me with fertility at an age that is no less than a miracle." So it's a pretty incredible story. As a matter of fact, this incredible feat, although it's not through natural processes, but to some extent, you could say that this incredible feat is even a greater miracle than that one that is recorded in the Bible of a 90-year-old woman giving birth to a son from a 100-year-old man, right? That's a pretty incredible thing, even with technology doing it. However, as much as this would be an incredible story, it's simply not true. It's actually a fraud. The website HuffPost.com actually tracked down the individual who took that picture, and the photo was actually taken by Sarah Ham of Gilbert, Arizona. She had brought her 2-week-old daughter, Kaylee Rowland, to meet her 101-year-old grandma, Rosa Camfield. So Anatolia's real name is actually Rose, and the child she is holding is not her son Francisco, but her great-granddaughter, Kaylee. So once again, it would be an incredible feat, but it's not true. A very misleading story formed around a very special moment. And while there has undoubtedly been significant advances in the last 100 years in many areas of science and technology and in medicine, the truth remains that there are still physical limitations upon us that come as natural processes of aging. And these are things that science is trying to undo. Nonetheless, science is not God. God created, and ultimately things decay. That's actually part of the second law of thermodynamics in science, that once something is established, it doesn't become more complicated. It actually starts to decay with time. So, with that being said, we understand that when it comes to childbearing, there is a time limit that is there. According to Wikipedia, the oldest verified mother to conceive naturally, and this is listed currently as of the 26th of January 2017 in the Guinness records, is actually Dawn Brooke, who conceived a son at the age of 59 in 1997. And one of the things that I want to be careful with as we're going through this message, I don't want to belittle the blessing that can come through pregnancies that involved these astonishing feats of medicine. I don't want to belittle that. But there is something to be said, especially as we're tackling this story today, there is something to be said when there are pregnancies through natural processes that seem to defy the laws of biology. There's something to be said about that. How does it happen? As stated already, one such miracle that is recorded in the Bible that we're going to be talking about today that defies explanation, and it's actually a record that has yet to be broken, likely will never be broken, but it is found in Genesis chapter 12, where it starts to kind of go through it, but it's found in the book of Genesis, and this is an event that starts to take place 10 generations after the flood. So after the flood takes place, in Genesis chapter 11, we're introduced to the man by the name of Abram, and we find out that Abram has a wife by the name of Sarai. In the following chapter, this is really where the story begins to form from, or the account begins to form from. Chapter 12 tells us where this story begins to unfold, and there is a promise that is given that actually can be tracked back to the garden after the fall, but now a promise is given to a man by the name of Abram. And this is a promise that, once again, is given at the garden, is given to Abram, and it's still something that the church celebrates back to today, or even to this day, I should say. Now, we're going to get to that at the end of the service, but Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 5 states that the Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on the earth will be blessed through you." So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot. And there's more that comes with that. We'll talk about that again in just a second. Now, at this point, Abram is 75 years old. I know that we have some around that age group in the room. So if you really want to get a face, just have them raise their hands. But you can kind of see what a 75-year-old man would look like. But Abram leaves the land of Haran, which, once again, I love to really, when the Bible talks about these locations, I like to know geographically what I'm looking at. So if you want to know where Haran is at, it would actually be located in northern Syria. It's actually southeastern Turkey. That's actually where it's at. And he begins to travel towards the land of Canaan, which is in Israel. It's a territory of Israel today. Now, this is a physical territory that Abraham and his descendants are promised that they're going to inhabit, and they still inhabit it to this day. That's where they're at today. So this account begins to lay out a foundation of the faith that Abram has, that he's actually willing to leave everything that he knows behind, and he's willing to go to a land that he doesn't know, but by faith he goes to, right? He doesn't know anything about it. The Lord just says, "Go, I'm going to show you the land where you're going to go to," and he just goes. Now, throughout the following passages, we're going to read about this physical land that is promised, but it's also stated that Abram is going to be a great nation. We're going to hear about that and kind of that developing promise. Now, here's the problem with this promise, and from our perspective. The time is ticking for Abram. He is 75 years old, And at the time that this promise is given, he's told that he's going to be the father of many nations, or that he's going to make him into a great nation. And the people that went with him, right, on this journey is his wife, his nephew Lot, which we talked about last week, who actually barely made it out of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then it says that he actually took all his possessions with, his wealth. And then it says that in Genesis chapter 12, verse 5, it states that he had takes people that he had taken into his household at Haran. So there's a group of people that are going with him, but really it's simply family-wise, the family household, it's just him and his wife and his nephew Lot, which actually we see ends up departing, and that's part of the story as well. And that's how he ends up in Sodom and Gomorrah, in Sodom. Now we get to chapter 15 of Genesis, and it records this other interaction that takes place between the Lord and Abram, and this happens through a vision. Starting with verse 1, it says, "Sometime later the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great.' But Abram replied," and this is where you kind of start to see the human part of it, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you have given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." Then the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." We live in central Minnesota. I live out in the country. If you live out in the country, you might know somebody out in the country. But when it's a clear night, you could actually see all the stars, and it is absolutely spectacular. It's a sight to see. And imagine, right, Abram, who has no kids, has no way of multiplying, and he goes and he's like, "Hey, you're going to have as many descendants as this." And that's a promise. And here's the thing. He has no kids, but Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Now, this is kind of setting up the entire Bible story and the Bible message, really. One of the things that we see is, we're going to see this in just a little bit right here in the next part of this. We see that Abram is counted as righteous, not because of what he's doing, but because of what he's trusting, who he's trusting. He's believing, okay, God can do this. Once again, age of 75. Abram is starting to look at things from a perspective of life and decay, though. Once again, time has elapsed. And he says, what good is to be blessed financially if everything that I am going to acquire has to be left for my servant? That's the heir. Once again, Lot departed. He was in Sodom. Abram comes to this harsh reality that there is no legacy. That's it. Everything that God will bless him with will ultimately become the possession of someone who's not even related to him. And sometimes it takes moments like this for us, even today, to see things through the lens of time ticking away. And for him, he begins to see this legacy that is going to end in his death, right? Once he's done, it's done. He sees a promise that is really hard to reconcile through his circumstances. He's old. How is God going to do this? And once again, God says, I'm going to give you a child. It's not going to be left for Eliezer. One thing that we have to keep in mind, and especially in this, as we see it already showing up, is that while Abram's faith is exemplary, right? Actually, he's mentioned again in Hebrews chapter 11 as one of the heroes of the faith. But as much as his faith is exemplary, you have to understand that both him and his wife are still broken individuals. And I know that sometimes doesn't register with us because we read the Bible thinking, man, I mean, these people are incredible human beings. And while there is definitely great examples of their faith, we have to understand they're still human beings that are broken. And that's what we see, as we go into chapter 16. And this is how it starts to develop. So before we get to chapter 16, there's a promise that is given. We already talked about that. Now we understand that this promise is not going to end with Abram, right? There's a son that's coming. And it's going to continue through his bloodline. So God's going to bless Abram, and he says, no, your son, Eliezer, is not going to be the one to receive the inheritance. There's a son, there's a seed. And that's a promise. One of the things that people of faith at times fail to rely on is God's sovereignty and God's power. Once again, there's faith, but we don't fully rely on his sovereignty and power. At times, we will try to bring into fulfillment God's promises by our own efforts. We're going to do it on our own. We're going to try to figure out how God's really going to carry this out, and we're going to insert ourselves into that picture. That's what happens. Verse 1 through 5 of chapter 16 is going to give us a glimpse into how even us today try to take things into our hands to fill a void or to fulfill a promise. And what we see is that problems follow when we do that, right? God has a plan, and we think, well, I think this is what God's calling me to do. And we try to kind of steer the boat. Starting with verse 1, it says that now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So once again, time has passed. Time is ticking. Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. And it states right there, one of the things that when we look at the Bible, we don't often take into consideration that there's a waiting process. It's not just happening consecutively. Sarai decides, hey, it's been 10 years, and it's time to take matters into our own hands to fulfill that void where you will have a son, and once again, there will be a blessing that comes through that son. And it's her trying to take it into her hands to fulfill a void that she felt she had not met for her husband. And ladies, and even for us guys, sometimes we feel like we're inadequate. We're not holding up our end of the bargain. And sometimes it leads to bad ideas. And at the age of 85, whether Abram actually thought it was a good idea, whether he did it to make his wife happy, or he simply took advantage of the situation, because once again, he's still a man, he goes through with his plan. And as much as we could look at this, and possibly it could be all three, but one of the things that we can at times do is also dig into it and try to give it too much thought and say, well, of course Abram's going to do it. There's an opportunity. But we also have to understand that it was his wife that suggested it. It shows the brokenness of both trying to reconcile God's promise, and they're both trying to figure out how we're going to make this work. Sarai's servant gets pregnant, and after the year elapses, after her pregnancy, verse 15 and 16 state that Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old, once again, because pregnancies take time. He's 86 years old now when Ishmael was born. Now, it doesn't really take a rocket scientist to figure out this is a recipe for disaster, right? I mean, your wife gives you another wife to have a baby with, and she can't have a baby, but she's giving you a wife to have a baby with. And we see it. There's tensions. There's issues that arise. And, I mean, imagine living in that tent, right? I mean, it's tense. And Abram is stuck in the middle of it. And here's the reason that Abram's stuck in the middle of it. Sarai asks her husband, Abram, to kick Hagar out. Now, Abram's stuck in a hard place because if she kicks Hagar out with her son, it's also his son. So he's stuck in a really difficult situation that is brought about by them trying to figure out how they're going to fulfill this promise. And one of the things that we're seeing, right, we look at the Bible and we often think it's disconnected from reality. Those people, had faiths that we can never attain. And while there are heroes of the faith that ultimately we're gonna talk about how this faith develops in the Bible, but we see that from the moment of the fall until Christ returns, people will be messy. They've been messy in the Old Testament, they were messy in the New Testament, they're messy today, and they will continue to be messy until we get home. That's just the truth of it. And we have to understand that just our messiness should not be normalized. As a matter of fact, it is because of the messiness that they give into that they all of a sudden have issues. There's issues. Whether it's that him as a guy said, hey, sweet, I get 2 wives. Which once again, we can't say that was the case. He might have been doing it to make his wife happy. Maybe it was him convinced that maybe that was the way that it was going to go about. And maybe his wife was speaking sanely about this promise that was going to be given. We can't know. Nonetheless, it shows a brokenness. And we have to understand that while faith calls us to do crazy things, and we see this in the Bible, the craziest things that people often do are actually birthed from our brokenness. Faith is crazy, but what we do in our brokenness is crazier. We will often look at Bible stories as well, and as we read these things, we think, well, why couldn't they have just waited a little bit longer? We have to understand, the Bible, as much as you turn a page, it's not in succession. We actually turn the page from, to chapter 17, and to chapter 16, and we saw 10 years had already happened. Chapter 12, chapter 16. We go to chapter 16 to chapter 17, another 13 years elapse. That means that Ishmael, Abram's son, is now 13. He's a teenager. And there's another interaction that's going to take place now. 24 years since Abram left Haran, we are now told Abram was now 99 years old, right? He started at 75, now he's 99. 24 years, the years have elapsed. We started in chapter 12, we're in chapter 17. We often tend to think it's like they could have waited a little bit longer. A lot of time has passed. A lot of time has passed. The Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai, and there are certain names that are used in the Bible, and some people believe that's the name of God. That's not the name of God. God's name is actually the Tetragrammaton, and that's actually 4 letters, YHWH. We pronounce it as Yahweh. That is God's name. This is an attribute of God, and it says it right there, El Shaddai, God Almighty. So this is an attribute of God, and he is revealing that attribute to Abram. I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants. At this, Abram fell face down on the ground. Then God said to him, this is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. And that's how we end up with Abraham. While there are some people that randomly pick their kids' names that they can only pronounce, they can only say, they can only spell, right? Similar to that one that if you saw the worship program, you learned of Scotview. But, there's different people that sometimes will just pick names randomly. But names are important. Not only do they identify who we are, but at times they define who we are. They very much convey the very essence of what we stand for. And this verse we're seeing that's exactly what's taking place. Abram's name is changed to Abraham to match the promise and his new identity that God has given him. And to really drive the point home, not only is his name going to be changed to the father of many nations, Abraham, but his wife's name is also going to be changed. So he's going to become the patriarch, and in verse 15 and 16 it says that then God said to Abraham, regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, her name will be Sarah. And I will bless her and give you a son from her. Once again, they took it into their own hands. They said, hey, it's going to be Ishmael. No, it's not Ishmael. It's going to be through her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants. Sarai is the matriarch in the promise. And her name is also changed to reflect the promise that she will be the mother of many nations. Now, one of the things that we try to focus on is, hey, learn how to study your Bible, whether it's a Bible concordance, or even if you look at your footnotes in that verse, it actually states that Sarai and Sarah both mean princess. That's what they mean. The reason that likely the name was changed from Sarai to Sarah was more so because of the dialect between Ur and Canaan. So in other words, it was more so where they were moving to. And so an example would be, my actual name is Roberto, but because I moved up north, I don't think anybody would be too happy to pronounce Roberto, so I go by Robert, right? So it's just a dialect. It's ultimately just a little change. So the name change for both identifies their efforts in fulfilling the promise, the name change for both is really identifying God's promise to them. And it really shows them, hey, what you tried to do, that was not the intent. But the likelihood of what is promised now seems really impossible. And that's a reason that I love how the Bible will give us insight as to not only God's promise, but even these people of faith, what their mindset was as God is promising this. So verse 17 states, then Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. How could I become a father at the age of 100? He thought. And how can Sarah have a baby when she is 90 years old? So Abraham said to God, may Ishmael live under your blessing. He's still trying to go to his plan, right? He's saying, hey, we already have a son. Let's do that, right? I mean, because we know that it's impossible. I can't have a son. Her and I can't have a son. So just bless Ishmael, bless him. But God replied, no, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. We have this man of faith who is still exhibiting an ounce of doubt. He's redirecting the promise to his efforts. May Ishmael live under your special blessing. That's not what God promised. That's not God's plan. The bloodline has to come from both the patriarch and the matriarch of many nations. But once again, at this point, right, the biological time clock is no longer ticking. As a matter of fact, that time clock has been rusted over, it's been ran over by a train, and it's been disposed of. It's gone, right? There's no possible way, which is the reason that he's kind of laughing to himself. He's like, yeah, right, that's not going to happen. And he's in disbelief because he's looking at this the way that most of us look at our situations, right? Through the lens of biology. It's not possible. That's simply impossible. In the following chapter, we get Sarah's response to the news. So once again, we already got his response. And this brings us to the conversation we talked about last week as we were talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, the two cities that were destroyed by God, and how Lot's nephew barely escaped as he had moved into that area of Sodom. But once again, we're picking it up, going backwards to that conversation where we had three men that showed up. And verse 10 of chapter 18 state that then one of them said, one of the three that had shown up, said, I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son. Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent, and then we get her response. Abram and Sarah were both very old at this time, and Sarah was long past, not partly past, long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, how could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old? And we're seeing, right? I mean, they're heroes of the faith, but still human. There's an ounce of doubt of how this could even be possible. I believe that the hardest moments in life that we face as Christians is when we're convinced by faith of God's ability, but are filled with doubt based on our understanding of what is possible. It is seeing what God can do, but understanding, but there's also reality that I just don't know how that's even possible. And these circumstances will often be the moments that will grow our faith. And the reason why is because it's not based on our understanding. It's not based on our performance. It is completely based on God's character. That's a reason that our faith grows, because we see, okay, God can do this. It is in those moments that we find ourselves with all avenues exhausted, right? We've tried everything that we possibly can in our own efforts, and then it's that moment that God comes in and he acts. Because you've tried everything and nothing worked. And it's those moments that leave us without explanation of how it's possible. And it begins to grow our faith. Even if we were to go to a different account, just really quickly and just allude to this, I really believe that by the time that Isaac is about to be sacrificed, if he would have been asked to do it here, I don't think he would have. You have to understand that by this point, Abraham has seen God work in so many ways. His faith has grown with every experience. And once again, this becomes evident when we see that nature doesn't permit it and science cannot explain it. So in Genesis chapter 21, verse 1 through 5, we come to the fulfillment of the promise that is covered in these 9 chapters through a span of waiting for 25 years for it to finally come. And it states this: the Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God said it would. And Abraham named their son Laughter, Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Now at this point, Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And it really brings us to this point where one could try to explain this through maybe this was simply a very unique event. Maybe it could be grounded through some sort of natural or ultimately explicable peculiar processes. The dilemma doesn't end with the pregnancy. And once again, as we've talked about this, we've talked about fire falling from the sky. We've talked about a guy being inside a big fish. We've talked about how there's so many things that really bring us to that point where we could say, well, that's not literal, that's metaphorical. And even if you were to say, well, this biological account maybe can be explained somehow through science, we have to understand that, once again, the Bible is giving us account after account after account after account where you can't explain it through science. You can't reconcile it through nature. You might find evidence in nature, but you can't reconcile it through it. And here's the reason that we can see this. And so if there was an atheist, an agnostic, whatever, right, that was questioning, this would be their prime rib for their argument right here. Because even if you could explain that, right, well, Sarah had a baby through some kind of natural processes. Even if I were to take that avenue, after Isaac's birth, we get a timeline described of what's going to happen afterwards. In Genesis chapter 23, verse 1, it states that Sarah was 127 years old when she died. This overshadows the longest documented and verified human lifespan of Jean Calment of France, who lived to be 122 years and 164 days. Even if you try to explain everything, now you have an issue. How does somebody get to live that long? Not only that, but now you're faced with another dilemma. Genesis chapter 25 states that Abraham lived for 175 years, and he died at a ripe old age, having lived a long and satisfying life. How do you explain that? Even if you can explain the pregnancy, now you have another issue. Abraham has a 75-year-old son, and he died at the age of 175. How is that possible? Because these are numbers that defy our understanding of the human lifespan and cycle. It doesn't make sense. And let me, once again, even make it more impossible for us to explain it through natural processes. Abraham is nowhere near the top of the longest living human that is recorded in the Bible. Methuselah owns that record at 969. So even if you can explain this medical mystery, you're left with a claim of age that defies explanation. And that's a topic that we're going to be covering next week. All the age brackets, right? That where people live so long, what happened? So once again, that's a topic that we're coming back to next week. But now let's wrap this one up. As with any other supernatural account, we always have to ask the question, why, right? Why does God do this? Is he just flexing his power, so that we could see it? Or is there a purpose for it? And I think it's both. I think we've partially already answered that God waits until the moment where it's physically impossible to do the impossible. But one of the things that we have to understand is the why. The promise didn't end with his son Isaac, with his grandson Jacob, or even with his great-grandson Joseph. This promise was given to Abraham, and it would carry to many nations. So now we're kind of getting a little bit more context. I don't want to diminish the significance of Isaac's life because it is important, but it was actually the lineage of Abraham that would ultimately yield the result that we continue to hold on to today. Galatians chapter 3, verse 16 states that God gave the promise to Abraham and his child. And this is Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. You could go and you could highlight it, you could make a note of it. But it says, God gave the promise to Abraham and his child. And notice that the scripture doesn't say to his children as if it meant many descendants. Rather, it says to his child. And that, of course, means Christ. Abraham is promised a son. And we even see parallels, right? So Abraham is going to sacrifice his one and only son. We begin to see this parallels pointing to Jesus. The lineage that we're talking about is following the bloodline of Abraham. And it's going all the way to his descendants until we get to the point, let's go back to the garden, of the seed, the child of Abraham that would crush the head of the serpent that broke the curse, and nations are blessed through today. Do you see that the story develops? It's all about Jesus. As we've talked about many times, Jesus says, you look to the scriptures because you think they yield you life, but all the scriptures point to me. If you're looking to try to get it right, even the people of the Old Testament couldn't. Right? They lived by faith because that's the only way that righteousness could be found. And that's a reason that we share in the promise. Not because we're related to Abraham through blood. Maybe some of you are Jews. I have no idea. But nonetheless, we don't inherit that promise because we're Jewish. Galatians chapter 3, verses 6 and 7 state, in the same way, once again, Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of faith. We saw that, right? The real children of Abraham are not those who are simply Jews by blood. They are those who put their faith in God. There's that word faith again. So this unique account really began the family of faith. We're seeing the family of faith begin pointing us to Jesus. Through genealogy, we can trace the life of Jesus back to Abraham, back to Adam. And then we see that we are grafted and adopted as children of God, not because who we're related to, but because of who we put our entire faith and trust in. It is the finished work of Jesus Christ by which nations are blessed, by which people are saved. And this is an event that the church continues to look back to. And it is a moment that we're going to reflect on back today as we observe communion.